Nora didn't cry when her father dragged her to the edge of the road, fingers clamped around her arm like a vice, and shoved a satchel into her chest hard enough to knock the wind out of her. She just stood there, shoulders square, chin high, her face carved from stone. She didn't ask why. She didn't beg. She already knew what was coming. His voice, thick with disdain, spat like venom. "Since you care so much for them, go live with one." That was his final sentence, his parting gift wrapped in scorn. The one he meant was Elijah, once a slave on their land, now a free man with a blacksmith's forge just past the township's edge, calloused hands that could shape iron and quiet storms. Word had gotten out already, murmured through the church pews, and sewn into the hems of gossip. Nora Calloway had been teaching letters to the children of freedmen. To her father, Reverend Calloway, that was more than betrayal, it was blasphemy. In his eyes, she had defiled her blood, dragged the family name through the soot, and for that, she was not only disobedient, she was useless. She had grown up, in lace gloves and taffeta gowns, in a house of hymnals and polished shoes, Sunday hats and polished forks. But that morning, she walked barefoot down the dusty road, her heels red with gravel and humiliation. The satchel on her back was too light to carry everything she'd lost, but every step she took carried the full weight of her father's disgust. Jeers followed her like flies, whispered behind curtains, murmured from porches, "That's the Reverend's girl, gone to the blacksmith." When she finally reached the forge, Elijah was shirtless, his muscled back gleaming with sweat beneath the harsh kiss of firelight. Iron sang beneath his hammer. He paused only when her shadow touched the edge of his light, raising his eyes with the caution of a man who had seen too much trouble in too many forms. "I didn't send for you," he said, voice even but firm. "No," she answered, steady as a nail. "But my father gave me to you, said it was fitting." His shoulders flinched, not at her presence, but at the word gave. He wiped his brow with the back of his wrist and gestured toward the small wooden house that stood crooked, but steady behind the forge. "There's a room back there. I won't stop you if you want to. Leave." But Nora didn't leave. That night she stood in the doorway long after the moon climbed high, listening to the town whisper her into a scandal. They called her the slave's wife, though Elijah hadn't touched so much as her sleeve. Inside, the room was barakat, a cracked mirror with its silver fading at the edges, and a Bible without a cover, its corners worn soft with use. She set her satchel down and sat on the cot's edge, fingers trembling for the first time since morning. No vows, no papers, no ring, just her father's voice echoing like a curse, and the strange stillness of a place that asked nothing of her. That night, Elijah left a bowl of stew at her door. He didn't knock. When she opened it, the bowl was warm, covered with a cloth, steam curling like a prayer. She ate alone in silence, her heart thudding with something dangerously close to safety. The cruelest man she'd ever known had discarded her like broken furniture, and the one they'd all feared had offered her food and a door that closed from the inside. For the first time in her life, she wasn't someone's daughter. She was just a woman with a name and maybe, one day, something more. Nora woke before the rooster, disoriented by the absence of barked orders and slamming doors. No cook hollering, no bells ringing for morning tea, just the rustle of wind, the distant hoot of an owl, and the sharp rhythm of Elijah's hammer striking hot metal. He didn't look at her when she stepped barefoot into the yard. "If you're staying, you'll have to earn your place," he said. "Ain't charity here." Nora didn't blink. "Then show me how." He paused just a beat, then pointed to a pile of warped and rusted metal. "Sort those by weight, not size." She nodded and got to work, palms soft and unprepared. The sun rose higher and her skin darkened beneath it, her skirts blackening with soot. Blisters formed where her hands had never known labor, but she didn't stop. Elijah said nothing, but once or twice his eyes strayed to her quiet, unreadable. At midday, a boy came running, barefoot and dusty. "Mr. Elijah." The wheel rim split again. Without a word, Elijah grabbed his tools and nodded for Nora to follow. She did, panting to keep pace, the satchel bouncing against her hip. They arrived at a worn wagon where a young black mother stood beside her mule, worry etched deep in her brow. Elijah knelt without comment and got to work. Nora offered The woman a drink from her flask and half a slice of bread from her apron. The woman blinked. You ain't scared to sit beside me? Nora met her gaze without hesitation. Afraid of what? The woman smiled small, but real. Of what folks'll say. White girl riding with him. They talk anyway, Nora said. Let them. When the repair was finished, Elijah pulled a small wooden bird from his pocket and gave it to the boy. Rough carved, not perfect, but beautiful. Nora watched his hands after that. How they were strong enough to shape steel and yet gentle enough to make toys for children. That evening, Elijah finally spoke. You don't belong here. Nora looked at him calm. I don't belong anywhere. He said nothing more, just handed her a cloth and nodded at her hands. You want salve for those? You have some? She asked, surprised. No, he said, but I'll make some. And from a man who rarely offered softness in speech, the gesture felt like poetry later. As she sat on the steps beneath a quiet sky, she whispered, will they ever stop hating me? Elijah stood in the doorway, face cast in firelight. No, but hate can't live where love makes a home. She didn't know it then, but those words would anchor her when the storm came. By the third morning, she swept the forge before Elijah rose. That day, he left out extra bread without comment, and at breakfast, he finally asked, what's your real name? She hesitated. Nora. He shook his head. No, the name you had before they stripped it from you. The one that means you. Her throat closed. I don't know that name anymore. Elijah didn't press. He just showed her how to hold tongs steady, how to listen for the hum of iron ready to bend. Her arms shook, but she learned. Good, he murmured once. Just one word, but it rang louder than a hymn. That afternoon, a man rode in, white, with a twitchy smile and a gun slung low like a threat. Heard you've got company, Elijah. Pretty one, he said. She's working, Elijah replied without. Paused up. The man snorted. That what we're calling it now. What's next? Half-blood babies. Nora stepped forward. I'm here by choice. That's what they all say. The man sneered. Till it's too late. Elijah didn't move, didn't shout. He just took one slow step forward. Get off my land, or what? You won't hear the second warning. The man spit on the ground and rode off, laughing. When he was gone, Nora's hands trembled. They'll never stop, she whispered. They'll come, Elijah said. But you're not alone now. That night, he carved her name Nora into a piece of cedar and nailed it above the forge door. Not guest, not girl, Nora. Why? She asked, fingers brushing the wood. Because they erased you, and I won't let them. For the first time, her name felt like it belonged not just to her, but to a place, a home. The next night, thunder rumbled over the hills like a warning, and Nora was behind the forge stacking kindling when she saw the figure emerge from the trees. The straight-backed silhouette, the slow gait, the glint of a Bible clutched, like a weapon. Her father. You've shamed me, he growled, soaked by the rain. Paraded your disgrace in a black man's home. Elijah stepped from the shadows, hammer in hand. You're trespassing, he said. Low. The reverend ignored him. She's my daughter. She's not yours anymore, Elijah said. Nora's. Voice broke through. You gave me away like cattle, sold me for silence. You lost the right to speak like I'm yours. Her father's face twisted, rain plastering his silver hair to his forehead. You were meant to suffer. That was the price of rebellion, and yet here you are glowing. He looked at her hands, dirt-streaked and raw, at the nail necklace Elijah had strung around her neck. You belong in shame. Elijah stepped forward, slow and steady. The reverend flinched. You've got no right to speak of belonging, Elijah said. This is sin, the reverend hissed. This is damnation. Nora stepped between them, voice trembling but firm. This is survival. This is someone seeing me and not looking away. Rain fell harder. The Bible in her father's hands wilted, pages curling inward like the words themselves had lost their conviction. If you stay here, he said, voice rising, you'll burn with him. Nora didn't move. Then let the fire come. Because, this time, I won't run. He turned, disappearing into the trees, the storm swallowing him whole. Elijah said nothing, just reached for her hand, muddy, shaking, real, under the leaking awning. Nora finally wept, not from fear, but from the unbearable relief of standing her ground and still being held. Elijah didn't reach for her, didn't offer her a single word. He simply sat beside her under the leaking awning while the rain fell, and her tears burned hot trails down her face, because some nights weren't made for comfort or answers, some were meant for silence and staying, and Elijah stayed, his quiet presence more sacred than any sermon her father had ever preached. When the storm finally drifted east, and the last rumble of thunder faded like a closing door, they rose and went inside, but the damage wasn't over. By morning, the town had already caught the scent of scandal. Whispers moved faster than the wind. The reverend's horse had been spotted limping away from the forge, wet and frantic, and though no one claimed to have spoken to him, the air around town shifted, cold, brittle, judgmental. The baker no longer waved when Nora passed. The grocer dropped her change into her hand without so much as meeting her eyes. At the well, a woman Nora had once taught to read turned her back and muttered to a friend, loud enough for Nora to hear, lying with a slave and calling it love. She's cursed, that one. Nora didn't flinch, but that evening, when she lifted the hammer at the anvil, it came down harder than she intended. Sparks exploded into the air like visible fury, sharp and dangerous. Elijah didn't ask. He'd seen the stairs too. You don't have to stay here, he said as he hung up his apron, voice low and even. We can leave. Head west. Start again, where no one knows your name. Nora shook her head slowly, breath thick with resolve. If I leave, it's like admitting they were right. Elijah stepped closer, watching her closely, his brows drawn together. Then what do you need? She looked down at her blistered hands, callous now but still trembling. I need to be seen. Not as a warning, not as a scandal, as a woman who chose her life, and chose it with her eyes open. That night, they walked hand in hand down the dusty road to the town church, the very one where her father had stood above the pews for a decade, preaching judgment with fire in his voice and venom in his smile. The doors were locked, but they hadn't come to pray. Nora stepped up the old stone steps, her breath steady. In her hands, a small lantern and a single iron nail. She lit the flame and set it at the base of the carved wooden cross by the doorframe. Then she laid the nail on the threshold. It wasn't rebellion, it was remembrance, a quiet declaration of everything she had forged with her own hands, pain into purpose, shame into strength. Elijah stood behind her, resting his hand on her shoulder. No words, just the weight of him, like a promise. By morning, the nail was gone, but the meaning lingered in the air like smoke. The townspeople still whispered, still turned their faces, but something had shifted. A child waved shyly as Nora walked by, and one morning, a plain woman, silent and always watching, left a basket of fruit outside the forge. No note, no explanation. When Elijah found it, he smiled faintly. They won't all come back, he said. Nora nodded, brushing her fingers over a bruised peach. I don't need them to. I just need one truth to be louder than their silence. And when they stepped back inside, Nora tied on her apron like it was armor and stoked the fire higher. If the world refused to make space for their love, she would carve it out with fire and steel. The first signs came softly, almost like a trick of the mind. A dizzy spell at the anvil, the acrid scent of hot iron suddenly making her stomach churn. She blamed fatigue, or the weight of being a woman building a life in defiance of an entire town. But when the nausea came daily, and her hands shook while sewing a torn seam on Elijah's shirt, she paused. She didn't tell him at first. She told the chickens, whispered her suspicions into feathers and straw as she scattered feed. She counted the days, then the weeks, tracing the memory of that stolen summer after the auction, when she and Elijah had quietly moved from survival to something tender and rare. That evening, as Elijah stood toweling off from his bath, steam curling around his shoulders, she stepped close. I need to show you something, she whispered, guiding his calloused hand to her belly. It's early, but I think. Her voice trembled into silence. Elijah froze, eyes widening. Then slowly, something softer overtook him, fear, awe, disbelief, and something deeper. Still, reverence. A child, he said, his voice barely there. Our child. Nora nodded, eyes shining. I know what it means in this town, but I won't hide." Elijah dropped to his knees, pressing his forehead to the swell that barely showed beneath her apron. "Then we won't hide together." As the days passed, her body changed, her back ached, her appetite shifted. The forge's fire made her sweat, but she kept working. Elijah started lifting the heavier loads without asking. "You carry life now," he told her gently. "Let me carry the weight." The whispers doubled in speed. The widow, pregnant by the former slave she'd secretly married, the Reverend's daughter, now bearing sin's fruit. But Nora stood at the forge with her hands blackened and her belly rising like a promise. And when people came to have horseshoes mended or rims straightened, she didn't look away. She met their eyes. Some turned, some hesitated, some stayed. One afternoon, a boy thin, barefoot, dust in his hair, stood watching. He'd once been Elijah's neighbor before the town torched his family's shack. His eyes fell to Nora's belly. "Is the baby gonna be born black or white?" he asked. Elijah crouched beside him. "He'll be born whole. That's what matters." The boy looked uncertain, but he stayed and swept the dust while Elijah worked. It was enough. That night, Nora sat by the fire, feet up, Elijah rubbing circles into her aching ankles. "Are you scared?" he asked. She leaned her head back, eyes closed. "Yes, but not of being a mother. I'm scared of raising someone strong in a world that punishes strength." Elijah kissed her forehead gently. Then, "We'll raise them louder than the world." Nora believed him, because everything they'd built had once seemed impossible, and yet, here they were crafting a life the world never gave them permission to dream. For months, she'd avoided her father's Bible. It sat untouched on the barn's high shelf, wrapped in an old piece of linen and tied with a faded black ribbon, her mother's ribbon, the one she used to mark the page where he stopped preaching. Nora hadn't touched it, not because of God, but because of what it represented: condemnation, betrayal, the moment she'd been handed over like cattle. But one quiet morning, Elijah gone to town, and the baby fluttering softly inside her like wings brushing water, Nora felt drawn to it. She brought the Bible down with careful hands, unwrapped the linen, felt the familiar weight of it in her lap. The leather cracked at the spine. She wasn't expecting revelation, but when she flipped it open, a folded note slipped out, yellowed, brittled out. The writing on the front stopped her breath. Asterisk for my daughter, if she ever forgives me. Asterisk. She unfolded it slowly, fingers trembling. Asterisk Nora, asterisk asterisk. I know what I did can't be washed clean, but I need you to understand I wasn't punishing you. I was punishing myself. I saw in you everything I failed to protect in your mother. You were too strong, too proud, too much like the woman I loved and couldn't save. I gave you to that man because I thought he'd crush you into something the world could tolerate. But you rose, and he saw you the way she did. I see it now. If you're reading this, know I did love you. I just never knew how to love someone who wouldn't. Ben. Asterisk. Tears filled her eyes, but they weren't like before. The letter crumpled in her lap, the weight of it sinking deeper than anger. She didn't forgive him. Not yet. But she understood him, and that, somehow, was a step. When Elijah came home, dusty from travel, she met him at the door and handed him the letter. He read it in silence, then folded it again and looked at her. Does it change anything? Nora shook her head. Not what I am, not who we are. But that night, before they climbed into bed, she lit a single candle in the window, not for her father, not for peace, for the child growing inside her, a child who would carry both fire and mercy, a new kind of inheritance, one born not of silence, but of truth. As Elijah rested beside her, hand over her belly, she whispered, "We'll raise them in truth, even the hard kind." He kissed her shoulder, voice low. "Then they'll never have to find love the way we did by surviving it first." It was near dusk when Elijah first saw the footprints by the river, small, uneven, scattered along the edge where the sand met the stones. He'd come for water, humming low to himself, a habit born from old fear and long nights where silence meant danger. But something about those prints made him pause, too fresh to ignore, too small to belong to a man. He followed them slowly upstream, each step careful, until he spotted a shape crouched behind the reeds. A girl, maybe 10, hair tangled, face sharp with hunger, holding a burlap bundle close to her chest. She didn't run. She didn't flinch. "You the man who lives up there?" she asked, nodding toward the forge. Elijah nodded. "You've been following us, not you," she said, eyes narrowing. His chest clenched. "Nora." The girl didn't answer. She just stepped forward and held the bundle tighter. "My name's Ruth. My mama died by the old tracks last winter. Before she went, she said if anything happened, I should find the girl with the scar on her shoulder, the one the preacher tried to break." Elijah froze. Only one man had ever described Nora that way. "You knew her father?" Ruth nodded. "He gave Mama silver once, told her to keep quiet, but Mama said he owed more than silence." She reached into the bundle and pulled out a cloth-wrapped photograph, the corners torn and curling. In the picture, a young Nora, 16, maybe, stood beside another girl with the same fierce eyes. "That's her," Ruth whispered. "That's my sister." She shook her head, eyes distant. "He told me she died as a baby. I believed him. I believed everything. But the past no longer held all the answers." Truth had walked through her door wearing threadbare shoes and eyes that looked like her own. A truth that hadn't come with fury, but with hope, a beginning that wasn't taken, but offered. By dawn, word had spread through town like wind catching dry grass. At the general store, it began in hushes. On the church steps, it grew louder, laced with venom and fear. The slave boy took her in. They hissed. Now he's harboring another. The people, already brittle with their disdain for Nora's defiance, had found fresh reason to stoke the fire of their hate. One by one, they gathered at Elijah's cabin, not with torches, but with legal forms, ordinances, town codes printed on parchment and wrapped in the polite cruelty of bureaucracy. Sheriff Boyd stood at the front of the crowd, belly heavy with drink and pride heavier still. Clipboard in hand, he squinted at the front door like it offended him. "It's not about race," he said flatly, lying with the ease of a man long practiced. "It's about regulations. 2 girls living alone with a man. That ain't decent." Nora stepped into the doorway, Ruth behind her, arms crossed tight against her ribs. "We're not alone," Nora said, voice calm. "We're a family." Boyd snorted, spitting onto the packed earth. "Not by law, you ain't." Elijah stepped forward then, slow and deliberate, his expression unreadable but voice ironclad. "And what law says a man can't protect who he loves?" Boyd's jaw twitched, the clipboard creaking in his fist. "This town's got no place for charity cases and broken girls pretending they belong." Behind him, a young deputy shifted his weight, eyes darting to Ruth with uncertainty. "Sir," he muttered, "maybe this ain't." "Quiet," Boyd snapped, silencing him with a glare. "They got till tomorrow, then that land's no longer theirs." He turned, boots kicking dust, the crowd trailing behind him in confused silence. Less a mob now. More a herd, still dangerous, but unsure of their charge. That night, Elijah didn't touch his stew. Nora didn't either. Ruth tried to stay brave, but her sniffles from under the blanket gave her away. The silence stretched long and frayed until Elijah finally spoke. "I've been running from fires all my life. Some burned fields, some burned inside men's hearts, but I ain't running now." Nora turned toward him, startled. "You'd stay, even if it costs everything." He met her gaze, slow and steady. "You are everything." She stepped across the room, reached for his hand. It was the first time she touched him that way, not in secret, not in shadow, and he didn't pull away. By morning, smoke curled from the chimney of Carver Ranch, and Nora, with Ruth at her side and Elijah just behind her, walked into town. Elijah held the deed papers high, thick and folded, signed and sealed by the same man who once claimed to own him. "He owed me more than freedom," Elijah said clearly, "and I've made something with it." The townsfolk stood silent. "Sheriff." Boyd glared, took one look at the deed, and spat again on the dirt. "You still don't belong." Nora smiled, her arm draped around Ruth. "We don't need to belong to you." And they turned away from the crowd, heads high, walking home not with rage, but with roots. They didn't burn the cabin. They didn't steal Ruth. Not because their hearts had changed, but because the law had. Weeks passed, then months. What had once been a humble shack at the edge of nowhere became something else entirely. A schoolroom on Wednesdays, a kitchen for the hungry on Sundays, and a porch that never stayed quiet after supper. Nora planted herbs outside the kitchen window, green and sweet-smelling. Ruth kept bees, fearless even when stung. Elijah carved shelves along every wall until books outnumbered bricks. The house felt full, alive, fueled by more than fire and effort. It was fed by purpose. People still passed slow, suspicious, but over time, the scowls softened. The whispers quieted. One day, the same woman who had once refused to sell Nora fabric walked up the hill. Daughter in tow. She don't read good, she mumbled. But I heard you teach. Asterisk. By the time Elijah returned with Ruth beside him, Nora stood at the stove, sleeves rolled high, flour up to her elbows, working dough with steady hands. The cabin smelled of salt and yeast and warmth. She turned at the sound of the door, wiping her hands against her apron, then froze as her eyes landed on the child. Ruth stood just inside the threshold, her arms curled around a worn bundle. Her eyes held no fear, only a strange knowing. Nora's gaze dropped to the photograph peeking from the girl's hand, and then back to her face and that heartbeat. Something inside her cracked wide open. Ruth stepped forward, voice soft. Unsure. Mama said your name like it was a hymn. I didn't know if you'd remember. Nora didn't speak. She dropped to her knees, arms wrapping around the child like they'd belonged there forever. No sobs, no trembling, just the stillness of something ancient breaking and becoming. Later that night, as Ruth slept curled beneath a blanket on the cot, her bundle tucked close, Elijah sat beside Nora, the lamplight flickering across his face. You didn't know. Nora didn't answer. She simply opened the door and pulled out an extra chair. The girl stayed all afternoon. That more followed. By spring, they called her Miss Nora in town. But Ruth, now taller, sure called her something else, Mama. She said one morning, quietly, while helping pin laundry to the line. The word hung between them, trembling like the wet sheet in Nora's hand. She turned, barely breathing. What did you say? Ruth blushed, looked down, but didn't step back. I mean it. I know you didn't birth me, but no one's ever stayed. No one's ever made me feel like I was worth staying for. Nora dropped the cloth espin and knelt in the warm dirt, eyes brimming. You don't have to call me that. I want to, Ruth said. And from that moment, she did. As for Elijah, he never asked Nora to marry him. He didn't need to. One night, long after supper, while the fire crackled low and Ruth snored gently nearby, he reached for Nora's hand, brought it to his lips, and said, I've been yours since the day you asked if I was cold. She leaned her head on his shoulder, eyes half closed. And I've been yours since the day you handed me bread without expecting anything back. They never spoke of forever. They didn't need to. Their home had no gate, no sign, no steeple, but it became a place where the tired came to rest, the hungry to eat, and the broken to find something like healing. Nora, once thrown away like rubbish, now stood in her doorway every evening watching her family grow, not by blood, but by choice, not by name, but by heart. And when people asked who she was, widow, servant, rebel, teacher, she only smiled and said, I'm hers, I'm his, and I'm my own. Because love, when it survives the fire, writes its own commandments. It carves new names into the bones of the world. Names no one can erase. Please like, share, and subscribe to help us share more true-hearted stories of lives rebuilt and strength rediscovered. And tell us in the comments if you had seen the fire coming. Would you have stood beside her, too?